history is repeating itself. It always has. We have disruption. And there are people who say we got to do that. That's right. And there are people who say, oh my gosh, we're ripping up the system. We have no idea where this is going. And maybe they're both right.
Hi, I'm Ed D'Agostino, and this is Global Macro Update. Our guest this week is David Kotok of Cumberland Advisors. David says we're in the middle of a new roaring 20s, and his reason, believe it or not, is the COVID pandemic and the disruptions that we've seen ever since. But before we begin, I want to sincerely thank you all for your incredible support. In just the past few days, we've added over 11,000 new subscribers. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. At Global Macro Update, we bring you in-depth interviews with leading experts on the economic and geopolitical forces shaping our world. Let's dive in. David, it's so easy to think in terms of, one lifetime or the recent past. But the reality is, and you show this in your book, The Fed and the Flu, pandemics have been with us since the start of history. And there have been a lot of them. I mean, you've studied them all, which is pretty amazing. Can you walk through what you would say are the most striking common traits that you've seen across all pandemics?
We started with a study of 19 that was captured in a Federal Reserve study very early in COVID. And we expanded that to look at as much history as we can. We had a master list of 314 epidemics in human history that have a record, and then we narrowed them down. And so in the book, we divide it into antiquity, what happened after the Black Death and the Dark Ages, and what happened in modern times in the Federal Reserve, particularly a lot of work on that. What we found in every single case, a pandemic, epidemic, plague kills people, not capital. So the capital stock remains intact. Poor people inherit very little from poor people who died. Wealthy people inherit from wealthy people who died and get richer. What happens to the whole? Wealth per capita goes up. Second effect, the pandemic triggers innovation and it forces it. We're seeing it right now electronically with AI, but we saw it throughout history. And the nature of the innovation is to force the more productive enterprise to replace the least productive. In the old days in agriculture, the least productive field was left to lie fallow. So what happened? The productivity per capita went up. Now, think about wars, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis versus a pandemic. They are all different. In a pandemic, wealth per capita goes up, savings rates change, the division between rich and poor widens, and productivity goes up per capita, and savings are more concentrated. So asset prices go up. And now look around in the last couple of years, and we repeat it again. So that's the first element of the book. We document it. We document it in ancient times and in modern times.
You were here to talk about your book, but you are a capital allocator. I mean, you have a money management business. Did you go long tech when the pandemic hit?
If you're in the tech sector, you're talking about NVIDIA and you're talking about the Mag 7, and they became such a dominant piece that literally if you tried to overweight the sector, in my opinion, you were gambling. You may have succeeded, but you are gambling. There's a limit to distribution and diversification, which is something my colleagues follow. So were we in? Yes. Never enough when it's going like this. If you were in the last few days, you might have felt different.
This book is The Fed and the Flu, which is, when you first told me about it, I thought, okay, he's doing a study on the pandemic. And knowing David, he's doing a study on every pandemic. But how does the Fed fit into this?
The trigger for the paper, Ed, was a marvelous research study that came out of the San Francisco Fed very early in COVID. And they examined 19 pandemics over 800 years. They used the Bank of England database, which is a marvelous database based on European interest rates and economics and history. And they used the UK and the US. And that's how they put together the 19. They defined what made up a pandemic, and the paper is on the San Francisco Fed website, and we, in the book, cite it and quote it and elaborate on it. So that was the trigger. And their finding was the neutral interest rate declines in the medium term. Not initially, you get a shock initially, but the neutral interest rate declines in the medium term in every single pandemic, no exceptions. And that is the case today in the United States and around the world with COVID. So I read that and I said, they really are onto something. You know, my history, I'm an old guy. I've been around. I read 1,000 research papers in my life, maybe more. And every one of them ends with more research is needed. Right? You've seen it 100 times. But every once in a while, there's a little spark, and these folks have a spark. So I said, gee, if the neutral interest rate is going to fall, why does it fall? Well, savings go up, the stuff I described. If that's so, we could be in post-shock for a roaring 20s, no inflation, progressive boom, which is exactly what followed the Spanish flu and the construction thereafter. And to some extent, it followed the Asian flu in 1957 after the Eisenhower regime gave way politically. Remember the early 60s? They were glorious. You're too young to remember them, but I'm not.
So what do you mean? How do you define the medium term?
The studies that are in the book measure that in antiquity, and that's 10, 20, 30 years, a long period. As we modernize and things happen faster, that contracts. So my view is we're in the post-COVID medium term now. COVID is not over. And the effects of COVID are visible in the United States because we have great data now. We have between 9 and 17 million people suffering from long COVID. We still have people dying from COVID, not as many as we had, but we still have them. And we have the computation of excess deaths cumulative for 4.5 years. We know the demographics before, and that's about 3 million dead people in America. The official count from COVID is about half that number, but if you look at the demographic trajectory, COVID has killed roughly 3 million Americans.
When you say 3 million Americans, are you including sort of people who maybe had pre-existing conditions, other issues wrong, and COVID exacerbated it?
Or accelerated the death and shortened the lifespan. So I use the concept of excess deaths, which is a basic demographic system. We had a trajectory where we could project deaths year after year after year. We knew the age of 350 million people. We knew a lot about them. Along came COVID, and suddenly the cumulative deaths are about 3 million higher than the trajectory before COVID after 4 years.
That is an elegant, non-political, apolitical way to look at it. Because
I didn't know it was possible to say anything that's not political today.
It's hard to talk about COVID without letting the politics seep in. So I appreciate the needle threading.
The long COVID issue is a very serious one because there's a calculation that you do in economics called disability equivalent lives lost, where you can take the amount of disabled people, apply it economically to the labor force, and you can then estimate what it would equate to if there were deaths. It's a smaller number if they're dead. And you do the same thing with quality of life adjustment. And what does that equate to? You and I know a fellow Maine camper, and he fished with us, he met with us, and COVID took and removed the hearing from one ear in one day. So he now has to deal with a hearing problem, which means he's got to take a hearing aid on this side, route it over and put it into a hearing aid on this side, and he's disabled. So you think about what it would mean for you if you lost your hearing on one side. I wear hearing aids, and I understand the deficiency. All I got to do is take one out. In his case, imagine trying to work with a new disability and then multiply that with quality of life loss, whatever it is. So we do this very elaborate economic guess to come up with the total size of the shock.
So in all of the pandemic studies that you've looked at, how would you say we did? We being the U.S. government, and the Fed. What did we get right, and what did we maybe in hindsight get wrong that we could have saw?
I would give the U.S. government about a C. Whether it's a C minus or C plus is a debate. We stumbled for a variety of reasons. And after the fact, it's very easy to finger point. So you can talk about Fauci politically. You can say he should be in jail. He's a criminal. He should get a Nobel Prize for medicine. Maybe both. So that's a political debate. When we finally got around to recognizing what had to be done, the medical community and the healthcare community got into it. The problem with disinformation is they had to overcome the information that was provided by disruptors or people who had a separate agenda. There was a guy in Florida who was selling bleach to people. He's a criminal. People got sick. Some may have died from it. Why?
Bleach to ingest?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
A bleach product, and somebody in Florida bought it from him. So I'm a libertarian. I think people have to take some responsibility, and if they want to follow this type of information flow and it hurts them, don't blame others. You know, how we went through that. By the way, in history, that has happened every single epidemic in antiquity, in the plague in Athens, in Rome, not just COVID. History repeats and repeats. So I would give us a C. We didn't learn from history, but when we got cranked up, we were able to deal with this pathogen, which was deadly. The Federal Reserve gets much higher marks from me. I give them an A. The fiscal response from the monetary response, which is very hard to do because we had a huge amount of each.
Right.
So the fiscal response wasn't necessary, but the Federal Reserve stabilized and preserved the banking system, provided numerous programs. Some worked, some didn't. They're all enumerated in the book. They're evaluated pros and cons. We have a whole section on the Fed. And the one criticism of the Fed that people level is they stayed too easy too long, and therefore they triggered too much inflation. That's an interesting Monday morning quarterback of the game. I find that one a little hard, and here's why. Ed is sitting in one of the 19 chairs in Washington at an FOMC meeting, and he's representing the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas. And you're going around the table and you're deciding, do we vote the first hike today? We've been looking at it for the last few months. We know we have an inflation festering, starting to bubble. And we're also in the middle of a pandemic, and it isn't over. And it's a pathogen which is mutating. Now, Ed says, I think we should hike the quarter point. And David says, Ed, the Delta variant is spreading in the US and has killed 20,000 people since our last meeting. Let's wait 8 weeks to the next meeting. Are you going to say, no, don't wait? Or does it really make a difference? Maybe we wait 6 or 8 weeks, because how do we know it doesn't kill 50,000 people in the next 8 weeks? We don't know. So I'm not a critic of the Fed. I think the Fed acted correctly, stimulus, and in my opinion, it's an opinion, prevented a depression. That's my opinion.
How do you see inflation today? Because it's really interesting, your point about the medium term interest rates going down. And we may, in fact, be living through it right now. Rates, as you and I are speaking, rates are going down.
If you do the classic economic model, you would look and say, gee, real interest rates are roughly 2.5. You got a 4.5% interest rate, you got 2.5% inflation, and you got 2% real. And if you look at market-based prices of things like tips, you can derive estimates of real rates. Now, what do we know about doing that? We know that the market-based price is the best reference we have, but that doesn't make it always correct. Otherwise, it wouldn't change. So if the neutral rate is truly lower, we don't know what the neutral rate is. We speculate about it, we study it, but we don't know what it is. If the neutral rate falls, and the rate that we're using is based on business cycle mechanics and Phillips curves and things like that, doesn't fall, then what do we get? We get a higher real spread because neutral went down. And what is the evidence from a higher spread if the neutral rate went down? Hard currency, fiercely hard, number one. Real growth, because any growth apparatus has to overcome that higher, wider spread. Productivity gains and roaring gains in the innovation area. Look around. What do you see?
Hey, thanks for joining us today. If you're new to the channel, please take a minute to subscribe and be sure to leave a comment. I read every single one. Now back to the interview.
I just used economic terms, Ed, but I'm describing a historical reference that the book found in Greece, in Rome, in the Dark Ages, when the plagues went through the entire when Italy had city-state plagues. What was the innovation then? The innovation then was in material used to fight a war, because that was the nature of the society. What is the innovation we're seeing now? Some of it is in material used to fight a war. It's called a drone. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if we'd had this conversation, would we ever be able to visualize the defense budget providing a beehive of drones, 1 million of them thrown at the enemy? Think about the evolution in war in terms of these new devices. So history is repeating itself. It always has. And if Churchill said, study history.
So what about governments? It looked to me in your book that governments also tend to come under pressure during pandemics.
Nearly every government that followed or was in office or in power during a pandemic shock, epidemic, plague, had disruption. Nearly every single one. Sometimes that resulted in a good outcome, and sometimes we didn't like the outcome. And that was true whether it was the Justinian plague at the end of the Byzantine Empire or COVID. We have disruption. There are people who want it. We're in it today. We get it in our news flow every night from a new administration. And there are people who say, we got to do that. That's right. And there are people who say, oh my gosh, we're ripping up the system. We have no idea where this is going. And maybe they're both right. Who knows? But disruption is the key. And we've got disruption. And it followed the Spanish flu. It followed the 57 Asian flu. The 57 Asian flu is a lesson for us, those of us who are in financial services and markets and assets and look at the Federal Reserve. And it's not very well studied. It's dismissed. We studied it. So real quick on the 57, Eisenhower was president. He launched a vaccine attempt against polio with the Salk vaccine. And until the sugar cube came along, it was a needle. And there was misinformation about polio. And Eisenhower wanted to try to suppress polio. He believed in vaccination. Along comes the Asian flu 3 years later. The Asian flu was diagnosed by Bruce Hillman at Walter Reed, got the slides. He called the president. He said, I'm seeing something about what's going on. What happened? He had a vaccine rapidly. Eisenhower now had a problem. He couldn't go back to the American public again. He'd been beaten up by the polio vaccine. So he orders enough to vaccinate and protect the military and the contractors. And he leaves the rest of Asian flu to the private sector to distribute the vaccine, which they did. And there were 6 companies. Merck was the lead, making it. And the public, some people protected themselves and some didn't. And some got sick and some died. And we had it extraordinary super spreader. We had the Boy Scout Jamboree in 1957 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. I was a Boy Scout and didn't go to that jamboree because I had to work in a Boy Scout camp that summer, and I had a job as a counselor, and I couldn't go to the jamboree because I didn't have that opportunity. So we put 30-some thousand Boy Scouts in Valley Forge with the Asian flu, and 8 weeks, 10 weeks later, they go back home and they make everybody sick, and we have an epidemic in the United States. Let's get to the Federal Reserve. I looked at the minutes of the Federal Reserve during that period. We read them all. McChesney Martin was the chair. He was a hard money, anti-inflation banker. The flu is not mentioned in the minutes. The disease is not mentioned. The recession is mentioned. The market reaction is mentioned. There are minute references where the governors are talking about maybe the market is worried about Eisenhower's health because of his heart condition. They never mention the pandemic. We have sickness all over the country. Silence, 1957, minutes of the Fed. This Fed, the Powell Fed, didn't make that mistake.
To bring it forward to today, David, you think we're in the roaring 20s again?
I don't know. I haven't seen a flapper.
Right. Yeah. No, not a carbon copy, but no. Ed Yardeni has been using that phrase as well, the new roaring 20s. And he's been fantastically right and money right for years now. I'm a little jealous of how right he's been. I'm grateful to have been reading him and you. What other lasting impacts would you say, either economically or societally or health-wise, are we in for that we maybe don't fully appreciate yet from COVID-19?
My worry is that half the country is paying attention to bird flu, to the measles outbreak in Texas and elsewhere, and the other half of the country has taken the position that is against public health and health care. So we are divided. And in my own family, which is multi-generational, there is division. So at a family gathering, we agree not to talk about it. So there's a child that doesn't have all the vaccines, including measles. I say, oh my gosh, measles. We had a call in our one of our morning calls, and Dave Burson, who is our chief U.S. economist, David from his history. Nationwide, Fannie Mae, he's got great credentials.
Nationwide, yeah.
Yeah. So we're having the conversation about is the measles shock in Texas spreading? It appears so. And does it have an economic consequence? It appears not yet, but it could. And Burson says, when I was 7 years old, I remember coming down the stairs, and my mother looked at me and said, "You have measles." So we remember measles. Now, what does that mean? So my worry is people like me believe in public health. We believe in preventive medicine. I have been a student of preventive medicine since I was in the Army in the 60s. I happen to be in a preventive medicine unit. My own stories in the book too. So I'm a believer, but there's 100 million people that aren't. And they are vulnerable two ways. They're vulnerable themselves and their families to a pathogen, and they spread the notion of pathogen risk to others. They reinforce it. And so we have miscreants who are taking advantage of them, just like the guy 4 years ago who sold somebody a bleach medicine in Florida.
David, how much do you think this is due to sort of the proverbial pendulum swinging too far in one direction and then you get pushback? Because I remember when my kids were little and sitting with my wife and looking at the list of recommended vaccines that our little baby was supposed to have. And it was voluminous, and so it wasn't just measles. It wasn't just, it was a lot. And we're sitting there saying, what are we putting into our kid? And we were selective.
I was the same way. How do we know? In the end, every question is an epistemological question. How do you know what you know? And that is where we are. I am truly worried about the attack governmentally on the health system. There is certainly waste, fraud, and abuse in every government, everywhere, every time. So those are cliched words. When it comes to healthcare, if the value is to keep somebody more alive, more likely to live without sickness, disease, or some other debilitating structure, then you have to have an excess to make sure you capture as many people as possible. So that excess has a cost. Americans, this rich country of ours, spends 18% of its GDP in healthcare. We have an enormous array of healthcare options available for some of us. And we have other friends and neighbors that don't have that availability. So we who are able use the system. I'm an example. I deal with a cancer. It's leukemia. I have a treatment. I have to tolerate it. I don't make any bones about it, and I don't keep it a secret because I believe I can help others come out and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to confront this. So I don't keep my disease a secret. The treatment I have which has kept me alive, didn't exist when I was diagnosed 7 years ago. But AstraZeneca came up with a second-generation drug. Now, think of the complexities. Where's it manufactured? South Korea. How did that happen? Well, we all know that story. What did we do as a policy before the middle of the 1990s? We made all the pharma, not all, we made a lot of pharma in a place called Puerto Rico under American supervision. And we passed a tax law change, 1996, and we gave them 10 years, and we said it'll sunset. And in year 11, Puerto Rico went into recession and has subsequently been the largest municipal bankruptcy around. And we drove pharma to go to India or China or someplace else. We did it to ourselves.
The story of healthcare in this country is so complex. You probably don't know. I spent a big percentage of my career in healthcare. I'm a capitalist at heart, and I was on the business development side, so I wasn't on the healthcare side, but I worked for a very large healthcare company. It's so complicated. I do think there should be a motivation for profit, but what I saw in my years in healthcare, it wasn't really capitalism so much as financialization. It was massive use of leverage. People don't realize how many layers of debt there are in your average nursing home or assisted living facility or hospital, unwinding this or just figuring out the fix is going to be, I don't know how you do it. It's going to be, God bless the person who attempts it and even gets halfway there.
We're doing it under the context you just described, but we're doing it. The change is underway. What the outcome will be remains to be seen. Now, suppose the bird flu, which is now, we know, mammal to mammal. It's not just chickens, birds, it's cattle, it's cats, it's cows. I mean, we know that. And we know that a human being can get it from an animal, get sick, and die. We have that as evidence. What we don't have yet is a mutation so that we see a cluster of people all infecting each other. That hasn't appeared yet. Maybe it'll appear tonight, maybe never. There is no way to know. If never, we will not know how this new system will operate and what the resilience will be. If there's a cluster tomorrow, I'm worried.
Is there any kind of policy recommendation you can give based on all of your study?
Collect as much data and information and make it public and don't distort it and allow as much transparency as possible. Because the people of goodwill or the professionals of goodwill need it. The people of ill will misuse it no matter what it is. And if they don't have it, they make it up. So appeal to the good guys and get as much information as possible and get it out. China covered up COVID in Wuhan. We know that. They then admitted it after the physician who discovered it died 2 months later. My metric for COVID, I was tracking 2019 and reports coming from China. And on December 30th was the first real definitive warning about this pathogen. But when I saw Taiwan close their airports to mainland flights on, I think, December 31st, I said, it's coming. Because they know and they have access to better information than we do. And we were in the middle of a trade negotiation. And we lost 2 weeks. Because all of a sudden we had to complete the trade negotiation. All of a sudden, Chinese had to come to Washington. Why all of a sudden? Because they knew. We didn't know. We weren't told what the United States knew. We weren't told, and the people in China weren't told what China knew. That's no good. And we paid a terrible price for that.
If there's one thing that's clear, it's that people in this country are sick of not being told the truth.
Exactly. Give me the good news, give me the bad news, but give it to me truthfully. Where we need a Walter Cronkite. We need a John Cameron Swayze. Now, I understand I've just made myself a real antique, but I admit it. You know, give it to me. Let me deal, but give me the facts.
David, you are one of the good guys, and you've done such great work, you and your co-authors, on the Fed and the flu. Thank you for doing it. This is an important book. I really appreciate your time. I always enjoy talking to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's nice to visit with you and to see you. Now, come back. Come fishing with me again.
I would love to. I would love to.
All right.